Hello, welcome to Riding the Corona Coaster, which is a series of 3 public workshops looking at life in the times of pandemic. And in this first workshop, we're going to be considering stress and anxiety. And I'm just going to make my technology play nicely for me. Just bear with me one moment. There we go. Okay, so really, as I say, we're looking at the ups and downs of living through a pandemic, and we're going to be considering understanding stress and anxiety. I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin, and I'm the co-founder of the Avexia Foundation, which is a charity that's established to support people's physical and mental health. So this program is made possible by the support of the National Lottery. And in some ways, these next 20 minutes or so possibly could change your life, also possibly could help you support the life of somebody close to you. So content's going to look a little bit like this. We're going to unpack this idea of stress. And in particular, we're going to look at things like one's personal capacity and coping mechanisms. Then we're going to look a little bit more detail at the nature of stress and what it does to us. Then we're going to switch focus and begin to look at anxiety, examine the fact that anxiety is an evolutionary asset and really comes in 2 main flavors, acute and chronic. And then the final part of the workshop is looking at practical things to do. So if you like, it's what I've called here life hacks and virtual life belts. So without further ado, let's have a look at this model because it's quite an interesting way of understanding stress. So if you have a look at this, what you can say is that everybody has a stress container. Some people have quite a large stress container, other people have a more modest stress container capacity. But basically, think about your stress container as that part of you into which stressors flow. So you see, stressors flow in, eventually your stress container is going to fill up. And eventually, as you see, your stress container is going to fill up and it's going to overflow or topple over, which is quite a useful way of understanding stress, and particularly understanding how sometimes it is apparently the smallest item that causes somebody to completely go off the rails, to have a complete reaction. And it's because it's not that individual thing. That thing was the last final drop that filled the stress container and caused it to overflow. So it's quite, I think it's quite a useful way of understanding our behaviors, particularly in very stressful times as we're living through at the moment, understanding that things are flowing into our stress containers almost constantly. And if we don't do something to mitigate that, it's going to overflow. And sometimes when people react or flare from apparently very minor things, it's because that was the final thing that filled up the stress container. So obviously, if you want to stop a stress container overflowing, you need to have a coping mechanism. And in this instance, it's represented by the tap on the side of the illustration here. And that coping mechanism is, if you think about it, you turn the tap on, it slows down or even stops the stress container filling up or overflowing. So obviously a stress container with a good coping mechanism is really one of the things that we want to strive for. So it's worth thinking about, what are your coping mechanisms? And the other thing that we're going to think about in a minute is, how can you tell when you're close to overflow? So it looks like this. So basically, it looks like this. So if when you come to this point and you've had a little think about the illustration, what I'd quite like you to do is to press the pause button and have a look at some of these questions, maybe even write a few notes, because that's quite helpful. What I'd like you to think about is, what are your particular stressors? Now, they will be particular to individuals. So what are yours? What are your stressors? What are the things that cause you stress? Then I'd like you to think about, what are your coping mechanisms? And again, I think it's one of the things we have to recognize and acknowledge here, that coping mechanisms can be both positive and negative. So the positive coping mechanism might be about quality family time. It might be about spending time with your nearest and dearest. It might be about picking the phone up and talking to a friend. Whatever the positive things are, it might be about going and working in your garden. It might be about taking the dog for a walk. You know, all sorts of things. Those could be characterized as the positive coping mechanisms. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there can be negative coping mechanisms. And again, we probably recognize these if we think about them. So, for example, solitary drinking is not an answer. It's a negative coping mechanism. It probably contains more challenges than it does benefits. So, you know, solitary drinking, I'm not saying all drinking is bad, but particularly solitary drinking, particularly drinking that is maybe not particularly controlled, is a negative coping mechanism. Likewise, what we might broadly call kind of non-prescription drugs or recreational pharmaceuticals, yeah, probably not the answer. Likewise, hitting things or people is not the answer. But occasionally some people, when their stress container overflows, they lash out. They'll lash out with verbal violence. And unfortunately, we're also seeing some people lash out with physical violence. So yeah, think about the positive and negative coping mechanisms. The third thing that I want you to try and have thought to is, do you know when that coping mechanism, when your stress container is getting near to being full? Because it's very likely that you have what we might broadly call a stress signature, a set of behaviors or a way of looking at things that tell you, actually, you know, I'm getting close to overflow here. I'm getting close to my limit. I'm getting close to the container falling over. If you can know what that stress signature is, you can actually do something in terms of your coping mechanisms to mitigate that overflow. So it's an interesting way of thinking about stress. But, and again, it's quite a big but, I don't think that we should see that stress is the evil character in this whole plot. It isn't. I think it's very important to realize that positive stress is actually very important. This model here, I think, explains what I'm talking about quite well. That you can see that if we have along the bottom axis here, increasing amounts of stress, I've used the index of emotional wellness going up here, but we could also look at kind of effectiveness in the workplace, happiness, whatever you want, really. But when we need an amount of what we might broadly call optimal stress. That is the point where we find reward. That is the point at which we feel we have control. That is the point where we feel we've really got our game face on. That is the point where, you know, we are feeling good. We are optimally stressed, so we are completely in control. We are feeling very positive. Now, equally, if we take the world of physiology, physiologically, the body needs stress. Muscles and bones need to be stressed to get stronger. So, you cannot have no stress. So it would be naive to think we can remove stress from life. In fact, I would suggest that optimal stress is entirely functional. If we look at the model here, you then, when stress increases, where it is beyond our particular ability, or we don't have enough time, or we don't have enough resources, that is, I think, when we get into distress, or you could call this toxic stress. This is the place where we find burnout. This is the point at which it's all become too much. So we've gone from being optimally, here we are optimized, we're completely playing our kind of A game here, and we've gone down to here, burned out. The trick is knowing where you are on this curve, because in the nature of these curves, it gets steeper the closer you get to burnout. I think it's also important to acknowledge, particularly in this time of quarantine and lockdown, that you can be under stress. You can actually have so much greater potential than you are able to harness, that in itself becomes toxic. That is the point where you are, as I've said here, you could be seen as being under stressed. If you're under stressed, you will rust out. So I think it's important to maybe revision the way in which we think about stress. It's not universally bad. In fact, a lot of stress is entirely functional. So, I've tried to break it down a little bit more for you here. So, we can see that, functional stress, that's where we find challenge, achievement, reward, identity. We feel satisfaction. We also feel that we are in control of our lives, and our lives might be complicated, might be really busy, but we're on it. We're right across it. And what happens physiologically then is that when you have that functional stress, you get a feeling of satisfaction. A lot of the kind of the body feel-good chemicals, a lot of the body feel-good hormones kind of are coursing through our system. Yeah, and it's going to make us feel better. It's going to make us feel happier. It's not simply a state of mind, it's also a physiological response. So those feel-good hormones will make us feel happier, make us feel better. It'll have a positive effect on things like our heart rate. When we've been stressed and then we relax, our heart rate becomes lower. When we've been stressed and relaxed, we get our blood pressure is lower. So there's lots of physical effects that are going on there. When we've toppled over towards toxic stress, that's when things become a little bit more negative. So here you've got these feelings of being overwhelmed. Here is where we find the fear of failure. Sometimes it's very close cousin is just you've been overreached. You're trying to do more than you possibly can, and then if you don't achieve maybe impossibly high standards, you feel a sense of worthlessness. You feel a sense of you don't have any control. It's also interesting to note that sometimes, particularly in the workplace, you'll find a situation where somebody is toppling towards toxic stress. And what they will do is try and spend more and more and more time in the workplace, and they become less and less and less and less effective. So kind of the long work pattern, the long hours worked, the pattern which is very typical to Britain, may actually not be healthy. And something which maybe one can think about if that's a situation. And I think it's particularly so if you're working from home. How do you differentiate between being at home or being at work? That requires a lot of self-discipline, and something which I think that it's worth structurally thinking about how exactly am I going to do that? Because if you are suffering with toxic stress, you will feel bad. It'll have a negative effect upon your sleep. It'll have a negative effect upon your cardiac health. Some of the drugs, the hormones, body chemicals that are released into the body under toxic conditions include things like cortisol, which are highly implicated in terms of cardiac events, heart attack, but also in terms of weight gain and obesity. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. So it's important to understand stress. The whole idea of these workshops is to help you to understand your challenge, know your enemy, if you like. Okay, so if we take stress, and it's the toxic response to stress usually triggers what we call an anxiety response. And I think it's important to understand anxiety. And I suppose the first thing to say is that anxiety is an evolutionary asset. It has come to us because in evolutionary terms it has allowed us to become the dominant species on the planet. and it's an asset which allows us and facilitates us perpetuating our genes, which is the kind of evolutionary drive, if you like. In very basic terms, it's the fight or flight response. Anxiety comes in two broad flavors. You've got acute anxiety, which is a moment when you have to respond immediately. And then there is chronic anxiety, which is where there's a kind of background. The background music is constantly about anxiety. These two things are related. So it is entirely possible, and in fact very plausible in current times, to have a constant level of background chronic anxiety. And that might be one of the things which is flowing into one's stress container. And then when the stress container overflows, what you have is an acute response to that overflow caused by the constant drip of chronic anxiety. The thing about anxiety, as I said, it's an evolutionary asset. It's also very powerful. There's a powerful response that comes particularly from acute anxiety. It is designed to get us away from trouble or to fight a challenge. And in psychological terms, the anxiety response resides in what's called the limbic mind, or the primitive mind. It's something which we're born with. It doesn't evolve particularly. It's something which we're born with. And it is what certainly drives children up to the age of about 3 when they develop language. So it's something which sometimes has been characterized by some authors as being the monkey mind. Very fast, very strong, essentially very selfish and a bit stupid. And that the human mind, or the rational mind, develops from about 3 years of age onwards, but it's the human mind that applies reason and applies understanding, intuition, empathy, all of which are pretty much absent from the limbic system or the monkey mind. So the thing about anxiety is it will affect your whole life. Clearly, it will affect your mood. If you're feeling anxious, if you're constantly low grade fight or flight, it's going to have a very negative effect upon your mood. It's going to be exhausting, but you're probably not sleeping very well because you have what's called hypervigilance. You're not sleeping very well because when you do sleep, fear takes over and you wake up with an acute anxiety response. So that will have a profound effect. That low mood that affects your sleep will also affect your physical and mental health. The mental health outcomes, I think, become painfully obvious. It'll also have an effect upon our physical health. As I said before, cortisol is highly implicated in terms of poor cardiac health. We're probably not going to be eating very well, so we won't have good digestive health. So there's lots of issues that are there in terms of physical and mental health. Particularly, again, with anxiety, can also have a negative effect upon our immune system. And heaven knows we need to have a good immune system. But what constant chronic anxiety does is produces a level of inflammation in the immune system, and it makes it less effective at fighting off opportunistic viruses, like the coronavirus, oddly enough. The other thing that I think is going to be very profoundly affected by by toxic stress and anxiety are our relationships with our nearest and dearest, but also more widely, our relationships with our neighbours, our relationships in social settings. The thing is that we're looking at a time of trauma, and trauma will find expression. It finds expression in the mind, it finds expression in the body, and I think we're also increasingly seeing whole societies that are being affected by trauma. So, I think it's worth pausing and thinking about that. However, that all sounds quite apocalyptic, and I think that what I'd like to do now is to become a bit more positive and to say that, well, as the slide says, what can you do? You are not disempowered. There are things that you can do. So focus on what you can do, not what you can't. This is an adaptation of a Chinese proverb, but small steps turn into miles. longest journey starts with the first step. So I think it's important to realize that actually you are not powerless. There are things that you can do. And what I want to do is to give you a few tips and life hacks to help you get through these times, particularly when stress turns toxic or when anxiety strikes. Okay, so first tip I'm going to give you literally is TIP. TIP. When that anxiety kicks in, when you're feeling overwhelmed by toxic stress, think TIP. You actually need to cool down because your physical temperature is increasing. It's part of the fight or flight response. So you need to cool down in some way. You probably need to go outside, go into the fresh air, undo the collar of your shirt, whatever. You literally are heating up. So find some way to vent some of that heat. You need to cool down. The I is intensity. What you need to do is to find an appropriate tension release for both the mind and the muscles. Now, key thing here is appropriate tension release and what works for you. What I would suggest is that something as simple as a short walk will have an effect upon your mood. As little as a 4-minute walk, brisk walk, as if you're late for an appointment, will have a positive uplift on your mood, and that'll last 20 minutes. So find something that's appropriate. And equally, in terms of the tension release for your mind, it might be about doing something else. Young people find release in gaming. Older people might find that kind of that mind release in terms of picking up the phone and talking to somebody, or going into the garden and doing some gardening, whatever. Yeah, but it's about doing something which releases that tension, because your body is getting ready to fight or fly, and you need to vent that tension in some way, and try and find positive ways to vent it, because as I've said before, some people's venting is quite negative and can involve verbal violence or even physical violence. The P is about being present. Be in the now. Don't be caught up in the past, because you can't change it. And don't get overly exercised about the future, because it hasn't happened yet. Yeah. So when that stress has turned toxic or when anxiety strikes, my first life hack for you is here. Think TIP. The second life hack is, and I called it here, breathing for headspace. And it's related to that model I showed you earlier about the rational and the limbic mind. The limbic mind kicks in very quickly, and it's very primitive, and it's very strong. It's your monkey mind. But as soon as you can pause, that monkey mind disengages very quickly, and the rational mind can take over. One of the ways in which you can do that is through controlling your breath. So, I've called it breathing for headspace. If you can control your breathing, you begin to tame that monkey mind reaction. This is a technique which is used by most of the blue light services. And what I suggest is you can think about breathing in a square. So you choose an appropriate number, but you breathe in, you hold, you breathe out, you hold, you breathe in, you hold. And you repeat that breathing in squares until the monkey mind calms down, the chatter in your brain calms down. You can apply your rational mind, and you can actually see things as they actually are. Third life hack, be active. WWFY, just to show I'm down with the kids. What works for you? And whatever works for you in terms of activity. I've mentioned it, it's also associated with the I of intensity in TIP, but be active. Find the thing that works for you. That might be going for a walk. That might be doing yoga online. That might be, dancing around the kitchen like there's nobody watching. It doesn't matter. That's what works for you. You might want to do Tai Chi. It's a mindful movement. You might want to do sport of any kind that is still permissible. I see people just going into the playing field and kicking a football from end to end. Yeah, whatever works for you. It might be also about just walking in nature. If we were in Japan, your doctor might be able to prescribe forest bathing. Walking in woodland is actually very good for the mind, body, and the spirit. So, be active. WWFY. Okay, so closing moments now, really. And what I'm inviting you to do is to have a little bit of self-reflection, to actually pause and think, okay, you've listened to what I've said, you've seen the diagrams, hopefully some of the things have resonated with you, but then in order for it to be of any use at all, other than just 20 minutes of your time, you need to reflect and you need to decide what you're going to do. Now, that does involve asking yourself some potentially quite uncomfortable questions. Here's one. Is it always the same things that cause you stress and anxiety? And the associated question with that is, are you doing anything to make things better? Or are you effectively held captive by those negative thoughts and feelings? I mentioned the Stockholm Syndrome here. It's where people who are being held hostage actually develop an emotional attachment to their captors. Well, are you exhibiting to some extent some Stockholm Syndrome in terms of the things that are stressing you? Are they the same things? Is it, are you constantly thinking about the same things that are causing you stress and anxiety? Are there things within that you could change? So I'm inviting you to think about, well, could you change things? If you can, how are you going about it? In terms of behavior change, there's a whole area of psychology on behavior change, mostly suggesting that if you do the smallest thing to give you some control, you do the simple things first, and then those things which felt too big to change actually become changeable. You've generally got about 6 weeks in terms of thinking about and actually cementing behavior change in the way in which you do things. And if there are things you cannot change, what you can do is change the way you think about them. So rather than being caught up in a kind of a doom loop or a ruminative cycle, where you keep going back to the same things over and over and over again, those things are your captors. Are you exhibiting Stockholm Syndrome by holding on to those things when in fact you could be free of them by changing the way that you think about them? Easily said, not so easy to do. But why not? As I've said, if not you, who? And if not now, when? Okay, signpost a couple of resources for you, which you might find helpful. Our website, the Avexia Foundation, is quite a repository of information, short films. So that's a resource that you can have a look at. The Mind charity is a fantastic charity. They are a tremendous amount of information on there. I've given you the link there to support tips for everyday living. Very, very good, very, very good charity. Paul Palmer, the chief executive of Mind, is an excellent guy, and it's a good place to go. The other thing we need to also be aware of is the NHS. Fantastic resource, particularly it supports our physical health with doctors and nurses and other medical professionals, but there's also a vast amount of information there for what we could call bibliotherapy, self-learning, self-healing. I've given you a link there that looks at stress, anxiety, and depression. There's a whole load more as well. So have a look, have a little rummage around. And the final connection there is Action for Happiness. It's well worth having a look. It's a very good organization, and they do some nice work in terms of trying to support people to be happier. Okay, so that finishes this first workshop. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next time, similar, but we're going to be looking at developing personal resilience, and in particular, looking at your, the resilience is your ability to bounce back. And the key thing is about resilience is it's a learned behavior. It's not something which is naturally innate. So I've been Dr. Ian Kenslin, and I thank you very much.